Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hi friends, welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Blurring the Line Between Reality and Fiction. And joining me on the show to chat all about this is Alexandria Faulkenbury. Hello, Alexandria.
Hi, Demi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. We're having some nice weather where I am, so that's always welcome in the midst of winter. What about you?
I'm doing great, and I cannot wait to chat with you about this topic. It's going to be a very fascinating one to discuss. But before we get into that, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey in publishing so far.
Sure, yes. So I've been writing for, like many people since I was a kid, writing little stories and scribbling in journals. And when I went to school, I kind of thought, oh, well, I can't really do fiction. That's not going to pan out for a career. So instead, I went to school to be an English teacher, and I got my master's in literature. And I did become a teacher. I teach composition, but there was still a little, kind of nagging voice in the back of my head that was like, what about all those stories you used to write? And when my oldest daughter went to school and I hadn't had my second child yet, I found myself with a little bit more free time. So that's when I started writing again. And yeah, eventually I wrote this book that's coming out now. This is my first novel, and was really pleased to find my publisher through all the journey of querying and searching for a publisher, which is always an adventure. And yeah, so I'm really excited for it to come out and for it to be in the world after working on it for so long.
That's so exciting, and we will be chatting about your book later on as well. But how does it feel to finally be at this point?
It's a little surreal, to be honest, and it's very exciting because I did work on this for a number of years. I think I wrote this as a short story, um, because I knew kind of that I wanted to write a novel, but I wasn't sure I could do it at that point. So I said, well, let me write this idea out as a short story and see where I go with it. And I did that probably in late 2020. So, and now here we are in 2025. So it's been several years. It's also a little terrifying because now I'm like, oh, wow, now everyone is going to read this thing instead of just hearing me talk about it. So that's always a little scary.
I love how it kind of came from a short story though. There's two short stories that I wrote that I love so much and I can see turning them into novels. Don't know if I'm going to do that or not, but I think it's really cool when authors kind of first play around with ideas as short stories and then get this vision for it as a full novel.
Yeah, definitely. Because sometimes you don't know. You have an idea, but you're not sure if it has the legs to be a novel, or if you can carry the story that far out. And so I think it can be really helpful sometimes to write it out as a story. And then you can tell at the end, do I feel like I could do more with this, or does it feel finished?
Yeah, no, perfect. Absolutely. So let's shift into our chat, and I want to start with a pretty deep question. And so I'm curious your thoughts on this. Do you think that it is possible for a story to be 100% fiction, or do you think there's always some reality mixed into that?
I guess I can only speak for myself on that matter, but for me, I would say it's a little impossible, I think, for it to be 100% fiction because when we write interactions between people, when we write characters, we're always drawing on our own experiences, So maybe we're writing a mother character who isn't our mother, but maybe something she says is, something our mom said to us once a long time ago, or maybe one of her little visual ticks that she does it is something our aunt did or our sister did. I feel like we always bring some bit of our experiences into our writing, whether that is auto fiction or just little glimpses here and there.
I completely agree with you. I think what's really interesting looking at reality and fiction is that there's obviously some genres that make it extremely clear that it's rooted in reality, like contemporary fiction or historical fiction that's set in a certain time period. You get the realism of that period. So there are certain ones that are very clear, like this is a fictional novel, but there is realism in it. The ones that can get a little tricky is when you get into like high fantasy and sci-fi, but even those, even if you're writing a completely different world or you're out in space on a reimagined planet or completely made up planet or whatever, I think you still have glimpses of realism because like you're saying is it comes from the characters and their interactions and also just in general like the author drawing on the emotion. I think emotion is huge in writing, and so if you have an alien creature getting very upset over something, those feelings reflect human feelings. So I think it's really interesting when you look at this span of the genres and the ones that are very clear rooted in reality, when the other ones that are more speculative aren't rooted in reality, but we still see glimpses of realism.
Yeah, definitely. I think any fiction, no matter where it's set, comes down to human interactions, what it means to be human, and how we interact with each other, and the relationships we form with one another. And no matter whether you're in fantasy world with dragons or if you're on another planet, like you said, talking to an alien creature, you're still exploring those ideas of what it means to be human and how we connect with one another.
Right, because no matter what kind of protagonist we're following, if they're human, if they're a fairy, if they're an alien, if they're an animal, like we need to have reader connection. And so, what are your thoughts on how portraying a character's voice and their point of view ties into this idea of they may be a fictional character, but they're also real in many ways?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that that is one thing that's always tricky when you're writing a story or a novel or whatever, is that you want the characters to feel like real people. And so to do that, they need to have their own individual personalities. You know, every character can't talk like you because then nobody wants to read that. So I think the more that, and I think that's where it comes down to, I think as writers, we often think of ourselves as wanting to be in our little writing cave and just writing forever. But we have to also be out in the world, having experiences, talking to people, listening to conversations about the people behind us in line at the grocery store having, because those things are the things that make our characters feel real when we sit down to write them in our little caves.
Yeah, no, I love that point because I think there's so many experiences, things we observe that can just bring inspiration. I know, like, there are even, like, settings as well. My first novel is set in Cincinnati, and I never thought I would set a book in Cincinnati, but at the time, my sister was living there, and, like, when I would go visit her, it was, like, such a cool city, and I'm like, "Okay, I'm gonna start writing my first book for my MFA program, and I need somewhere to set it. Why don't I set it in Cincinnati?" And so, like, there's fictional characters and there's fictional places, but there's also, like, real places I literally went to there. And so I think living in general and, like, traveling and meeting different people and really being open to different people's experiences, I think that can all kind of funnel into your writing because you can draw on all those different experiences to craft characters. And even if you have a fictional setting, you can base that setting off of a real place that you visited. So there's so many different ways that we can pull on reality to craft fiction.
For sure, and I was an army brat growing up. My dad was in the army, so we moved all over the place. So I've definitely used some of the places or settings or houses we've lived in as inspiration for some of the things I've written. So I think that's definitely true.
Yeah, for sure. So I think this also ties into what people say a lot to write what you know. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's kind of one of those things where there is some truth in it, but it's maybe not the whole picture, because I think when you're starting out, it is a good idea to kind of write what you're familiar with, because you have to get your feet wet somewhere and you don't want to be trying to learn the craft of writing and trying to learn, how to fly a fighter jet or whatever. So I think in the early days, it's good to write something you're familiar with as you're getting used to that writing style. But I think once you feel comfortable writing, it's good to learn new things. I mean, I don't want to write about the same boring things over and over again. And, I have had a lot of life experiences, but I've also only had my experiences. And if those are all you ever write about, then I think that can be limiting.
Yeah, really great points there as well. I think I think it's really interesting because when you look at this idea of write what you know, you can take it very literally and you can also be a little more abstract with it. Taking it literally, I feel like it's how we all start. Like, I'm a songwriter. Of course, I'm going to write a songwriter protagonist, and I do have a protagonist who is a songwriter, but they're not all songwriters. But it's also the idea of write what you know, which digs deep into your emotion and
True.
those happy moments, the depressive moments, the sad moments, all those things. And that comes back to the human connection and the human experiences. And so, more than the specific things like, oh, I'm a doctor, therefore all my characters have to be doctors, or oh, I live in Washington, and so all my stories need to be set in Washington. That's taking it very literally, but I think it's deeper to go into yourself and think about like what have I experienced on an emotional level and pull on those feelings and experiences because that's where the authenticity comes in. And this ties it a little too with writing about certain topics. Like, I personally would never write about a super controversial or sensitive topic that I don't have a personal experience with because I don't feel like I could authentically represent that. And so that's also this as well with pulling on you as a person and those complex parts of you and your experiences to portray those authentic experiences.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point because it doesn't matter what you're writing about, whether it's a doctor or a fighter pilot or an alien, everyone's probably gone through a breakup. So you can if your character's having a breakup, it doesn't matter what their job is, you can draw on your own experiences to make that feel genuine.
For sure. So, whenever we're writing things and we're mixing fiction with reality, for you personally, is this something that you consciously make a decision to do, or is it something that comes out subconsciously?
I think it's a little bit of both for me, I would say, because sometimes, for example, when I was writing this book, there were certain things that I have experienced or who have friends who have experienced that I wanted to put in the book because I knew that they would lend more of what we've just been talking about, authenticity, and they would they'd be something that the character could really grapple with because I know people who had really gone through those things. And I think other times it comes out more subconsciously, like if you're writing a character and you realize, oh, they flip their hair the same way that my sister does every time she gets nervous. So I think it's a little bit of a mixture of both. Of if you have something you're really trying to hone in on, you might pull from your own experiences, and then sometimes it just comes out and it can surprise you just as much as maybe the person reading it.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you. I feel like it's the same way for me. And I think it's really cool when it comes out subconsciously because you're not aware of it. At least I'm not aware of it when I'm drafting. And it really comes out when I'm reading back through, especially when I have a long period of separation between books. Like, for example, I just finished revising my young adult speculative thriller before sending it to my agent. And that's a book that I wrote at a time when I was like, dealing with, like, a really bad situation, like, a lot of manipulation. I, like, didn't like the person I was becoming. I was struggling mentally. Like, it was, like, really bad situation, and I wrote that book not knowing, like, how much I was projecting into, like, that story. Like, that's not my story, but, like, the things the characters are experiencing were, like, similar to what I went through, and, like, when I was reading that back during the final passive edits, it was, like, a little difficult to read parts of it because it was, like, the interiority, especially with the one character, like, struggling with, like, what she was going through was, like, I had that exact thought about myself, like, 3 years ago, and
Yeah.
so when it comes out subconsciously, like, it's very surprising, and I think it's really cool as well because our minds are finding ways of processing these things and maybe to heal from these things without us even knowing.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And you can realize, oh, I was working through that, even though I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, for sure. So, what advice do you have for any authors who maybe feel like they need to pull on their realities to write their story, but they may be hesitant for one reason or another?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you hear about this a lot when you're talking about memoir and like what you include and what you don't include in terms of how people might interpret it. And I think the advice you hear a lot from to memoirists is to write what you know, to write what your truth is, what happened to you. And I think the same can be said of fiction. And so the advice I would give would just be to write what you know to be true in your own experience. And if you're hesitant about including it, especially if you're writing fiction. There's a million ways you can dress up or dress down an experience to take it a couple of degrees away from being quite so close to you, if that's something that's making you nervous. For example, even with my own book, I was never in a cult, which there is a cult in this book, but I still drew on some experiences I had with, churches or people in authority above me that I wove into the characters in the story. So you can use those experiences without it being a mirror of what you lived.
That's a really good point, and I think that's where the line becomes more definite between reality and fiction because when we're writing fiction, you're not, even if it's based on a real experience, you're not making the character you and you're not making your character go through exactly what you did. If you did, it would be
Right.
more of like creative nonfiction, not
Sure.
fiction. And so if you're hesitant of doing it, like you said, there are several ways that you can change things. And I can see as well with if you want to base something off of a real experience and you want it to be fiction, I can see hesitancy coming as well from like changing it too much where it doesn't feel like the story you want to tell anymore. So that's kind of a line you have to walk too. But I definitely think that there isn't necessarily a fear of, oh my gosh, if I write this, like will people in my real life know I'm basing this mean person off of them. Like, you can definitely give characters very distinct traits and do things that completely separate that character or that situation from the real one.
Definitely, definitely.
Perfect. So now I would love for you to share a little about your book. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's called Somewhere Past the End, and it follows a young woman named Alice who has been raised in a cult-like community, and she has been wanting to break free from it for a long time. And when she's kind of on the verge of running away and leaving, there is this event that happens where a lot of people who are in the group mysteriously disappear, including her parents. And so then she kind of has to figure out how to pick up the pieces and what she's going to do now that this major thing kind of imploded all of her plans.
That sounds so good. Wanted to come out?
It comes out May 20th.
10 days before my birthday.
Oh, exciting! Birthday present.
So, when readers read this book, what do you hope they take away from it?
I hope that readers can immerse themselves in the story, and I hope that they can take away the idea that nothing is ever final, that you don't ever have to say, okay, this is my life and this is what it has to be because this is what it has been. And that there's always some other path that you can take, and that there's always a strain of hope, even when things feel like they're absolutely hopeless.
Perfect. Well, congratulations on this book, and I cannot wait for it to be out.
Thank you. Thank you so
You
much.
are so welcome. So, before we move on to your plot twist, I wanted to ask if you have any final thoughts to share on blurring the line between reality and fiction.
Um, any final thoughts? That's a good question. I think I would just say, kind of to reiterate what we've talked about a little bit, that I think you're going to do it no matter what. If you're writing, whether you intend to or not, some parts of your reality are going to find themselves into your writing. And if you can just embrace that, it will make you feel less stressed out about it, I think. So for me, I just kind of wrote what I wanted to, and my experiences came in where they did. And that was important for me to get everything out on the page at once. And then when you go back into your edits, you can say, that's a little too close to home. I'm going to change that. Or, well, that doesn't really feel quite like what I expect. You can always change things in edits, is basically what I'm saying.
That's a really great point to end on because I'm someone who, and I need to get over this when I'm drafting, it's like, oh, it gotta be perfect, it gotta be perfect. But
Oh,
I'm like
yeah.
a huge revision fan. I love editing, which makes sense because I'm an editor. It would make sense. It wouldn't make sense if I hated editing and I was an editor. But it's one of those things where like you can always change things. And so if you
Mhm.
write a character that's like too close to somebody in your real life, you don't have to stress about it because after that draft is done, you can intentionally go back and change things.
Yeah, and for me, I also love revisions because when I'm drafting, I don't know, I almost feel this sort of sense of anxiety that I'm gonna miss something. So when I'm drafting, I try to just like spit out every idea from my head and to make sure there's nothing I missed, there's nothing I forgot. And then I love the process of going back in and just like cutting things that don't work. But I know that I got it all on the page the first time, so I don't have to stress about cutting it the second time.
Do you edit as you go?
Not in my first draft, no. In a first draft, I just try to get everything out of my head, and then my that second pass through when the first editing round is kind of my favorite because then that's where I feel like it starts to really get shaped into what it's going to eventually be.
Can't relate. I edit as I go.
Okay, yeah, my husband is that way. He's a historian, and he will, like, make sure his each sentence is perfect before he moves on to the next one.
Yeah, no, I go back and read the previous chapter and tweak it, edit it, polish it, and then move on. If I don't do that, I get so distracted and I can't focus.
Sure, that makes sense, and that's why I think it's so great that every writer has a different process, and they
Yeah.
all get to great books in the end.
Yeah, perfect. So now we've made it to your plot twist. Are you ready?
Okay.
This is a fun one. So Valentine's Day is coming up, and if you could go on a date with any fictional character, who would it be and what would you get them as a gift?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Oh, a fictional character. I'm gonna go with I just read the book The Husbands, where the main character gets a different husband every time her current husband goes up into the attic, a different one comes down. So I'm gonna say I would pick a mystery husband from her attic, because it's kind of fun in that book because anytime she doesn't like one of the husbands who comes down, she just sends him right back up. "Oh, I forgot a box of pictures up there. Can you go get it?" And then she gets a new husband. So I think that would be kind of fun for an evening. And, oh gosh, a gift, my goodness. Maybe Oh goodness, I guess maybe a nice dinner because they traveling from who knows where coming out of that attic.
That is such a cool concept for a book. I have to read this.
It was really fun. I would recommend it.
Perfect. Well, this has been so much fun. Can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you online?
Sure, yes. So, my website is just alexandriafalkenbury.com, and you can find me on Instagram. My handle is AM Falconbury. You can also find me on Blue Sky at the same handle, and I am still, for now, hanging in there on Twitter/X, and my handle there is Lexi Burry.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. And listeners, that is a wrap on this chat with Alexandria, all about blurring the line between reality and fiction. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing you think would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thank you for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.